I have heard Abe address a group of young people and say, the person standing before you right now, in many ways, is a big loser. I'm a loser. I lost in Spain. I wasn't on the winning side in Spain. I went down to Mississippi in 1964 and tried to do some organizing work in an all-black county, and was physically assaulted. And did he get rid of Jim Crow in 1964 Mississippi? Obviously not. He went down to Nicaragua in the 1980s and tried to, again, build a community center, a place where people could organize, improve their lives. And the Sandinistas burned it all down. So Abe would say, if you're looking for a winner, I'm not your guy. I've been on the losing end many, many times. But you don't get into a conflict. You don't stand up. You don't raise your voice because you think you're going to win, because you think you're on the winning side. You do it because it's what's right. You do it because your heart and your mind tell you that this has to be done. And that's why you do it. So, for example, he lived for a time in Venice Beach, California. And he was trying to promote a playground in a prime piece of real estate. There was nowhere for kids to play. And so Abe wanted to have the city dedicate this plot of land for a playground. Of course, they wanted to develop it and, get lots of tax money from maybe some condos or big houses or whatever. So he and his friends under cover of night built a playground, at least a functioning playground. And then they got kids and parents who were involved to basically chain themselves to the playground equipment. And he basically forced the city to say, okay, do you want to arrest a bunch of kids on a playground? Is that the look you want? And so he was very creative in his protests. In fact, he said that, mischief has a role to play in radical work or in activism or in advocacy. Abe would say, I occupy the mid-space between optimism and pessimism. And he would say, if I do have a victory, sure, I celebrate, but I know that defeats are coming. And if I have a defeat and, I get my ass handed to me, I know that victories are coming. And I heard Abe share this with a group of men serving life terms in a Washington prison. And one of the prisoners wrote me afterwards and said, that statement that he made is what is helping me get through this, because you can't be an optimist in prison. But if you go down that road of being a morbid pessimist, then, your life is over right there when you make that decision. So I'm going to try to occupy that space in the midpoint, in the middle of that hazy area. And I think for a lot of us, especially activists and advocates who are up against it, maybe if we occupy that space, we'll become what Abe would say, long distance runners. A lot of sprinters. There's a lot of sprinters in advocacy and activism work. They're on fire. They see something, and then they see what it takes, and they start to lose, and they get rebuffed, and they get arrested. They get whatever it is. They lose a job, and they're out for the count. Abe was interested in helping young people to become long distance runners.
I think it's good for us to start with this memory that you shared. It's very vivid. It brings us right to Abe, and he is what this story is based on. So let's start with Abe.
Because I'll jump in right here, if that's okay. I first met Abe in 1974. I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He had come to town to screen his brand new film called Dreams and Nightmares. And at the time, it was an important moment for me because I have deep connections with the Lincolns on both sides of my family. And I knew about their stories. I had grown up hearing about this stuff, but I didn't really know much about them. And Abe's film, and also meeting and getting to know him, really inspired me to get to know more of these people from the human side, which is something I've been doing for a number of years now. And the thing about Abe that so impressed me too was the fact that, his life did not stop with Spain. I'm sorry to say there are some vets who survived whose sort of life stopped in some ways in 1939. But Abe was a filmmaker. He was an artist. He was a skilled artisan, a carpenter. He had a very full life. And that film was really important for me. I stayed in touch with him. And once ALBA was formed and I got involved with ALBA, I did a number of different events with him, corresponded with him. And he always seemed to me to be a kind of embodiment of everything that was great and good about the people that volunteered for Spain.
As some of you know, I was born and raised in Italy and spent most of my good chunk of my early years in Europe. So the Spanish Civil War was very much part of my life, of my political awakening, and of the world I lived in terms of friends. And my high school teacher was a Spanish vet. And I ran into Abe a few times in the 80s, but the first time we really got to spend some time together was in 96. When I went to Spain together with the veterans for the 60th anniversary of the arrival of the International Brigades in Spain. So there was a very, very large commemoration both in Madrid and in Barcelona and elsewhere. So that's where we spent some time together. And it was a very, very moving experience because, in fact, there he and many other of the vets, men and women, were interacting in arenas and stadiums and towns around the country with literally tens of thousands of young people. So there really was this sense of purpose and of a flame being carried on to a new generation. And in my conversations with him and with others, that's the time he told me about his arrival in Spain, how he's one of the veterans who swam into Spain. One of the volunteers who swam with Spain. But the fact that it happened in that very, very important moment when the veterans passed their experience on to a new generation of Spaniards was a very, very important and very, very moving experience. And I was very, very grateful to be part of that.
I launched the Oral History of the American Left archive at the New York University's Tenement Library in 1976. And over the period of the next half dozen years, interviewed hundreds of old timers. Now the grant was for immigrant old timers, so they tended to be of an even earlier generation. As it turned out, many of them Yiddish speaking communists and former communists. But in doing that, I ran into a half dozen of the former volunteers and saw the key role that they had played within the history of the left in general. But I think more specifically, they carried a vital memory of how the struggle in Spain was a sort of turning point for the American left at large. It's important to remember that the Spanish drama takes place just about the same time as the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, was organized by the hundreds of thousands, a very, very radical labor movement, and a very much of a coming from below radical labor movement, as opposed to what the labor movement had mostly been since the days of the IWW. And at the same time as the Spanish Civil War, or just slightly after, we get the formation of things like the American Slav Congress, with hundreds of thousands of Slavs who were very often part of the CIO and represent, along with more than a dozen other ethnic groups and African Americans, a sort of a sweep of people from various parts of life, but especially of people who felt excluded from the WASP American life, that idea still being dominant, really in many cultural ways, the sweep into the mainstream as a moment of struggle that carries on really through the end of the Second World War and a year or two after, until the repression comes down on everyone and all these massive movements. But the Spanish Civil War could easily be seen as that turning point when the American left assumed an importance that it hadn't had since, say, 1912, and that it wouldn't have again until the end of the 1960s.
They were the greatest, in my view, of the greatest generation, if you want to run with that well-known thing, right? They were there 5 years before the rest of the U.S. And the leadership came along. And the question remains, what would have happened in 1937 if the full weight and might of what the U.S. had to offer was thrown in support of the Republic? Now, Abe would tell me this was never going to happen, and he makes a good case for that. But if it had happened, what would have happened? It would have been a signal to Hitler immediately that his, incursions into other territories would be immediately opposed by a formidable, foe. So I don't know what would have happened. I'd like to think that the worst of what happened in World War II could have been avoided. And we'll leave it at that.